The rain came down in relentless sheets, soaking the quiet suburban streets outside Whitmore High, as if nature itself was setting a tone for the day ahead. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed faintly, the halls echoing with the last-minute chatter of students rushing to class. Claire Whitman adjusted her umbrella, shook off the dampness from her coat, and smoothed her skirt before stepping into her first senior English class. At 28, she carried herself with an air of calm professionalism, but beneath the surface, a coil of nerves twisted. This was not her first year teaching, but it was her first at this school, new colleagues, new students, and new eyes evaluating her every move. The classroom quieted when she entered, the shuffle of books and whispered conversations fading as rows of seniors regarded her with the kind of detached curiosity only teenagers could muster. At the back, half hidden by the dim light filtering through the rain-streaked windows, Evan Carter Saturday. Unlike the others, he did not feign disinterest or whisper to a friend. His sharp, observant eyes followed her every move, his notebook already open, as though he had been waiting not for the lesson, but for her. Claire began with a poem, her voice steady, weaving rhythm into the silence of the classroom. As she read, the room grew still, yet when she asked for interpretations, she expected the usual surface-level remarks, hurried guesses, or feigned analysis. Instead, Evan's voice broke the silence. His words were not rehearsed or superficial, they carried weight, depth, and an unsettling intimacy. His interpretation peeled back layers that mirrored truths Claire herself rarely admitted aloud: loneliness, the aching hunger for connection, the quiet despair of unmet expectations. For a moment, her breath caught. The classroom, with its rows of restless students, seemed to vanish, leaving only her and Evan in a silent exchange. Their eyes met, and in that fleeting lock, an unspoken recognition passed between them, raw, sharp, and dangerous. The connection was instant, yet impossible to name. Whispers began in the background, a few students chuckling, one voice teasing, "Looks like Carter's trying to impress the teacher." Claire smiled politely, brushing it aside, but her chest tightened. Evan, however, smirked in a way that was neither playful nor dismissive. It was guarded, knowing, as if he understood the line he had crossed but had no intention of stepping back. The rest of the class continued in a blur, Claire's practiced rhythm rattled by the earlier exchange. When the bell finally rang, she gathered her things with deliberate calm, determined not to linger on the unsettling spark. Yet as the last student drifted out, she noticed something on her desk, a folded sheet of paper, left without a name. She hesitated, glancing toward the door just in time to see Evan slip out into the hallway, his shoulders hunched against the weight of unseen thoughts. Unfolding the paper, her eyes skimmed the lines, and her breath caught once more. The poem written there was raw, unpolished, yet strikingly familiar. It spoke of isolation, of longing, of an invisible cage that suffocated without ever touching the skin. It was not a student's exercise, it was someone's confession. Every word seemed to echo pieces of her own private struggles, the loneliness she buried beneath her professional veneer. Though no signature marked the page, suspicion coiled inside her. It had to be Evan. She pressed the paper against her desk, her fingers trembling, her mind spinning with the realization of what had begun. It was not a flirtation, nor even a friendship. It was a connection too intense, too forbidden, and too dangerous to ignore. At 28, Claire Whitman was in a stage of her life that was supposed to feel stable, settled into a career, maybe a marriage, maybe starting a family. Instead, she found herself beginning over again, carrying invisible wounds she tried to disguise beneath neat blouses and carefully measured smiles. A year earlier, she had broken off an engagement that had unraveled in bitterness, the man she once believed she would marry exposing the same controlling patterns she had grown up with. Leaving him was both liberation and failure in her mind, freedom from toxicity but also proof, in her own eyes, that she was somehow unworthy of the stability she craved. Teaching became her anchor. Each lesson plan, each essay she graded, was a brick she laid in rebuilding the life she wanted, even if the foundation beneath her feet felt fragile. Beneath her professional poise, there were still echoes of her childhood, nights spent with an alcoholic father whose rage was unpredictable, mornings marked by her mother's absence after she finally walked out and never returned. Those scars hardened Claire, but they also hollowed her. She longed for connection, but she carried herself as if she didn't need it. To her students and colleagues, she was calm, dependable, the new teacher trying to fit in. But beneath that steady exterior, she felt unseen, overlooked, and quietly terrified of repeating her past mistakes. For Evan Carter, the world was a performance he had long grown tired of staging. At 18, he was a senior with undeniable talent for writing poems, stories, fragments of thought that spilled from him like lifelines onto the page. But his talent, instead of bringing him pride, often drew ridicule. His peers saw him as arrogant, too intense, too unwilling to play along with their shallow games. Yet what they didn't see was that writing wasn't a choice for Evan, it was survival. Behind the polished image of his family, with their big house and his father's respected reputation as a lawyer, lay a home built on fear and silence. His father's control was suffocating, not just in rules and expectations, but in sharp words and, when challenged, sharper hands. His mother, trapped in her own resignation, turned her eyes away, her silence complicity. For Evan, there was no safe space except his notebook. He poured into it the thoughts he couldn't speak aloud, the rebellion he couldn't risk enacting, the pain he could never show. To the world, he was trouble. Teachers whispered about his attitude, peers mocked him for being different, his father treated him as a disappointment waiting to happen. But under the defiance, Evan was just a boy suffocating in shadows, waiting for anyone, to actually see him. Claire and Evan's world seemed impossibly different, one a woman rebuilding from adulthood's betrayals, the other a young man struggling to escape youth's cages, but at their core, both were trapped in loneliness. Claire was warned quickly by colleagues to watch out for Carter, their whispers framing him as trouble, a boy with too much edge and too little respect for authority. She smiled politely, nodding at the advice, but something about those warnings only deepened her curiosity. Evan, on the other hand, was constantly branded by his peers as an outsider, mocked for speaking too earnestly, dismissed as arrogant when he voiced thoughts they couldn't comprehend. Both carried reputations that concealed their truths. For Claire, her broken past was hidden beneath professionalism. For Evan, his pain was disguised as rebellion. What drew them toward one another wasn't romance, not yet, but recognition, two souls who had walked through very different fires yet carried the same ashes. For Claire, hearing Evan's words felt like finding a reflection she didn't expect to see in a classroom full of teenagers. For Evan, Claire's quiet steadiness suggested someone who might actually understand the language of his silence. Their connection, though unspoken, became a tether. Dangerous not because of what it was in that moment, but because of what it could become, a bond that crossed lines, fed by the ache of loneliness and the hunger to finally, truly be seen. The library was supposed to be empty that night, its rows of bookshelves standing silent under dim fluorescent light, the only sound the rain drumming faintly against the tall windows. Claire often stayed late, grading essays in the quiet, preferring the solitude over returning to her empty apartment. That evening, though, she wasn't alone. A muffled sound drew her attention, a sharp breath, a choked sob, coming from the far corner between shelves. Her instinct told her to leave, to respect privacy, but something deeper urged her forward. There, slouched against the wall with his notebook open but forgotten, was Evan Carter. His face was streaked with tears, his composure shattered in a way no 18-year-old ever wanted seen. At first, he stiffened when she approached, his guard flashing back into place. But then, almost as if exhaustion tore through his defenses, he whispered the words that chilled her. "Sometimes I think the only way out is to disappear." The rawness of it cut through her professional walls. This wasn't defiance or arrogance, this was a boy dangling on the edge of despair. For a moment, she felt frozen, caught between her role as teacher and her instinct as a human being. Kneeling beside him, she didn't offer platitudes or authority. Instead, she spoke softly, firmly, "Don't disappear. Your words matter." The silence after hung heavy, charged, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, of being seen, maybe for the first time. And in that moment, a fragile bond was born. After that night, something unspoken began to weave between them. Claire tried to dismiss it, telling herself it was just a moment of compassion, nothing more. But the next morning, when she entered her classroom, she found a folded poem tucked carefully into her desk drawer. The handwriting was unmistakable. The words, raw, unfiltered, and painfully honest, echoed the voice she had heard in the library. At first, she hesitated, tempted to return it, to scold him, to set boundaries sharp and clear. Yet she didn't. Instead, she slipped the poem into her folder, her chest tightening with something she didn't want to name. The next day, another appeared. And then another. Each piece felt like a confession, a diary entry whispered into her hands, and though she knew it was dangerous to keep them, she couldn't bring herself to throw them away. She rationalized it as encouragement, as validation for a gifted writer who needed to be heard. But beneath that, there was a truth she refused to say aloud: she needed the words, too. In his poems, Evan stripped away masks she had worn for years. Their connection was not physical, not romantic, but it was charged, two lives intersecting in secret, each feeding the other's hunger to not feel invisible. Still, shadows began to form. Students noticed Evan lingering after class, slipping into her room when others were gone. One day, a girl snickered after spotting him leave, whispering just loud enough, "Something's going on." Rumors, once whispered, began to grow teeth. It didn't take long for the whispers to reach ears beyond the classroom. Claire was summoned to the principal's office, the sterile smell of coffee and paperwork filling the room as she sat across from him. He wasn't accusatory, not yet, but his words were edged with warning. "Be careful with Carter," he said, his tone heavy with implication. Claire's pulse quickened, her throat tightening as she tried to steady her expression. She wanted to protest, to insist that nothing inappropriate had happened, that she was simply guiding a student who needed support. But she knew how it looked: an 18-year-old boy slipping into her classroom after hours, poems tucked secretly into her desk, her too calm demeanor when asked about him. The principal's words lingered, a reminder of how fragile her position was, how quickly her career and reputation could crumble under suspicion. Walking back to her classroom, the hallways seemed louder, the glances sharper, every laugh or murmur carrying an edge she couldn't quite shake. She hadn't crossed a line, not really, but in the eyes of others, perception was its own truth. For the first time since arriving at Whitmore, Claire felt the walls of her new life closing in. And yet, even as fear coiled tight in her chest, she couldn't bring herself to push Evan away. The bond between them, however dangerous, had already taken root. And with each poem, each stolen moment, the stakes rose higher for him, for her, for both of them. The spiral began at home. One evening, Evan's father discovered the stack of poems hidden in a drawer beneath school papers. The pages were torn free, read aloud with venom before being ripped apart and hurled into the trash. "Stop writing this pathetic garbage," his father snarled, voice sharp enough to cut. "Be a man." The words were followed by fists slamming against the desk, a hand gripping Evan's collar too tightly. By the time Evan arrived at school the next morning, his sleeves hid faint bruises, and his usually guarded eyes seemed heavier, darker. Claire noticed instantly. She always noticed him. In class, when his voice faltered during a reading, she caught the flicker of pain beneath his careful mask. Her instincts screamed to reach out, to ask, to protect, but she knew the boundary she was already too close to crossing. Yet restraint became impossible when she saw the quiet trembling in his hands as he scribbled lines into his notebook, words flowing in defiance of his father's cruelty. Claire's chest ached with recognition. She had once been the child silenced by someone else's rage, told she was worthless, desperate for an escape. Watching Evan was like seeing her younger self, the rawness of a wound she thought had scarred over. It tied her to him in ways she couldn't unravel. The isolation he carried bled into her, rekindling her own memories of abandonment, of not being chosen, of being left behind. And though she told herself she couldn't get involved, she already was. The bond that had once lived only in poems and glances began to spill outward, no matter how hard Claire tried to contain it. She started journaling again for the first time in years, pages filled not with lesson plans but with fragments about Evan, his words, his bruises, the haunting mirror of her own past she saw reflected in his silence. In private, she blurred lines she would never admit aloud, sketching his voice into her diary like a lifeline she couldn't let go of. Meanwhile, the world around them grew sharper, less forgiving. Teachers whispered in hallways, their voices low but heavy with implication. "Whitman spends a lot of time with Carter, doesn't she?" Students, too, were watching. A girl in class, infatuated with Evan, posted on social media, "Carter and Miss Whitman, we all see it." The rumor spread like wildfire, feeding on teenage speculation and adult suspicion alike. Every whisper felt like a stone added to Claire's chest. She told herself to pull back, to create distance, to protect both him and herself. But each time Evan read aloud in class, his voice trembling yet burning with conviction, she was drawn closer, unable to stop. His writing spoke the words she had buried for years: freedom, love, escape. And she couldn't deny the pull of hearing. Her own secret desires echoed through the mouth of someone half her age. To others, it was scandal. To her, it was recognition, dangerous and undeniable. The breaking point came one afternoon after class. Students filed out, laughter and chatter echoing down the hallways, until only Evan lingered, his notebook clutched tightly in his hands. Claire tried to dismiss him gently, reminding herself of the warnings, of the rumors, of the danger that shadowed every interaction. But before she could, his voice broke through, low, steady, and raw. "You're the only person who's ever really seen me." The words struck with the force of confession. She froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. He stepped closer, not with romantic intent, but with desperation etched into every line of his face. "If you leave, you'll prove my father right, that nobody ever stays." The silence that followed was unbearable. Claire's throat burned with the weight of her own history: her mother who walked out, her father who drowned himself in bottles, her fiancé who broke her trust. Evan's plea echoed every abandonment she had ever endured. She should have set the boundary, should have reminded him she was his teacher, nothing more. Yet she couldn't. The air between them pulsed with everything unspoken, everything forbidden, everything they weren't but already were. In that moment, Claire realized the danger wasn't just external: the whispers, the rumors, the principal's warnings. The danger was inside her, the part of her that longed to be seen just as much as he did. And for the first time, she feared not the world outside, but the truth she carried within. The storm that night was relentless, sheets of rain lashing against windows as if the world itself was breaking apart. Claire sat curled on her couch with papers spread across the coffee table, the glow of a single lamp keeping her company in the silence of her apartment. The knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, Evan stood there drenched, shivering, his hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes wide with a desperation that silenced every rational thought. "Don't send me back," he pleaded, his voice cracking under the weight of exhaustion and fear. Against every instinct to protect herself, against every whispered warning in her mind, she stepped aside and let him in. She wrapped him in a towel, set a mug of tea before him, and listened as the dam inside him broke. His words tumbled out: years of bruises, his father's cruelty, his mother's silence, the suffocating weight of being told he was nothing. Tears streaked his face as he gripped her hand across the table, holding on as if it were the only thing anchoring him. In that fragile grip, something shifted. It was not lust, not impropriety, but a love too raw to define, a bond born of recognition, of two broken souls who had found each other in the wreckage. Claire knew the line had been crossed, not physically, but emotionally. And in that moment, she didn't care, but dawn betrayed them. As the rain eased into grey morning light, Evan slipped quietly out of her apartment, shoulders hunched against the chill. What neither of them realized was that someone else was watching. A neighbor across the hall, suspicious of the late-night visitor, snapped photos on their phone, images of Evan leaving Claire's apartment alone, his clothes still damp, his expression too raw to be mistaken. By noon, whispers swelled into wildfire. The photos circulated through the school like poison, reaching the ears of administrators, then the school board. Claire was summoned, her voice trembling as she denied what they implied, but the weight of perception was crushing. Suspended pending investigation, she walked out of the building with eyes following her, judgment clinging to every step. The true devastation came when Evan's father seized control of the narrative. Furious over the scandal, furious over his son's rebellion, he wielded his authority as a lawyer like a weapon. In meetings, in letters, in veiled threats, he painted Claire as predatory, manipulative, a woman who preyed on his vulnerable son. The truth of Evan's suffering was buried beneath his father's influence. The man who silenced his family now worked to destroy Claire's career, ensuring she would never teach again. For Evan, it was unbearable. Watching the only person who had ever truly seen him being torn apart because of him, he made a decision that would shatter what little was left. He would expose his father, no matter the cost. The school hearing was tense, the air thick with speculation and scandal. Teachers, board members, parents all gathered with narrowed eyes and hushed whispers. Claire sat at the front, pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her future hanging in the balance. When Evan was called to speak, the room shifted. He stood tall, notebook in hand, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Instead of a statement, he began to read one of his poems, raw and unflinching. His words painted the truth not in accusations but in imagery, the survival of a boy beaten into silence, the salvation found in a connection that never touched skin, but lived in breath. The room stilled. No one moved, no one spoke, as his voice cracked yet carried, slicing through the air with a clarity no defense could match. For a moment, Claire felt both exposed and vindicated, every word both her salvation and her undoing. Then his father erupted. Fury boiling over, he stormed forward, grabbing Evan's arm, dragging him away as the boy shouted that he would not be silenced anymore. The spectacle left the board reeling, the audience murmuring, the air split open by truth and denial colliding. Claire sat frozen, her career in ruins, her heart torn between devastation and pride. Evan had bared his soul for her, for himself, but the cost was unbearable. As he disappeared from the room in his father's grip, Claire was left behind in ruins, accused, but still tethered to the boy who had made her feel seen in ways she never thought possible. The aftermath was brutal. Claire resigned before the board could make its final ruling, her letter clipped and formal, though every word felt like a wound. Within days, headlines and social media posts spread, twisting rumors into false certainties. Predatory teacher suspended. Strangers spat venom in comment sections, colleagues turned their faces away in hallways, and neighbors whispered behind closed blinds. Her teaching license was revoked, the career she had built brick by brick collapsing in a matter of weeks. With her savings dwindling, she moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, bare walls, second-hand furniture, the hum of traffic replacing the sound of students' chatter. She was broken, yes, but strangely free as well. For the first time in years, she was not bound to expectations, not chained to the performance of being perfect. The world saw her as disgraced, but in the silence of her new life, she felt the stirrings of something else, survival, and perhaps, rebirth for Evan. The fallout became a turning point. His father's wrath only deepened in the weeks that followed the hearing, but something in Evan had shifted. He no longer bowed his head, no longer swallowed his voice. He packed his things in secret and left, moving into a small rented room with the help of money his mother quietly pressed into his palm. For the first time, she defied her silence, her eyes filled with something between guilt and pride. Evan applied to a writing program in the city, pouring into his application the poems that had once been hidden, torn, and dismissed as worthless. Rebellion became liberation. Though the world branded him as scandal's shadow, he began to craft a future of his own, choosing built on words, not chains. Every line he wrote became an act of defiance against his father, against silence, against despair. He was still haunted by Claire's absence, but her voice lingered within him, echoing the night she told him, "Don't disappear. Your words matter." They never saw each other again, not face to face, but through a trusted friend, an older teacher who had always sensed the truth. They began to exchange letters. Each envelope carried fragments of the bond they could never live openly. Claire confessed the ache of loss, writing, "We couldn't speak it, but we both knew it was love." Evan echoed the words in his own hand, his letters pulsing with gratitude, grief, and a fierce kind of loyalty that time could not sever. In their separate worlds, they began to rebuild. Claire started writing her first novel, shaping their story into fiction, finally reclaiming her voice on the page where no board or law could silence her. Evan published his first anthology of poems before he turned 20, dedicating it simply, 4C. The world that once tried to crush them became their audience, unknowingly consuming the art born of their forbidden bond. They remained apart, but in words, they existed together, two survivors who had found empowerment not in holding on, but in transforming pain into creation. Their love was never lived, never touched, but it endured, etched in ink, carried in silence, alive in every word they wrote.